Okay, so in this video, I am going to continue to review and supplement some of the content in your textbook's first chapter, or Module 1A, which is an introduction to cognitive psychology. Okay, so in today's video, we're going to start by reviewing some of the early schools of thought or theories that had a profound influence on cognitive psychology today. So we're going to talk about the school of thought called structuralism, as well as behaviorism. And then we're going to end talking about Edward Tolman and his cognitive maps. Okay, so let's kick things off. So most of you who are familiar with the origin story of psychology, as it were, you know that in 1879, Wilhelm Wundt, he was German, so you don't pronounce the W's, or you pronounce them with the V sound instead of the W sound. So in 1879, at the University of Leipzig in Germany, Wilhelm Wundt established the first psychological laboratory, right? And he, along with his graduate student Edward Titchener, founded this school of structuralism. And so basically the objective of structuralism was to do what chemists do for the chemical elements, right? But instead of focusing on chemical compounds and things like that, Titchener and Wundt wanted to focus on the mind. So they wanted to formally establish a discipline that used the same sort of precision and scientific prowess that chemists and biologists and physics uses, but instead of focusing on natural phenomena, they wanted to focus on the mind. So essentially what Wundt and Titchener wanted to do is to distill the mind down to its most basic elements. So they wanted to take our experiences and break those down into the most basic elements, or the fastest and simplest mental processes. So how did Titchener and Wundt go about doing this? Well, they established a technique known as analytic introspection. So instead of using undergraduate students like we would today, Wundt actually used his own graduate students as his participants, and they received a lot of extensive training prior to taking part in these experiments. So if you were one of Wundt's graduate students at the University of Leipzig during this time, what Wundt would have you do is he would present some kind of stimulus. So he might show you a flower, or he might turn on a metronome, or he might have you eat a piece of chocolate, right? So after he exposed you to each of these different stimuli, he would ask you to verbally report what your immediate sensations were, what your emotions or feelings were with respect to the stimulus, and also any mental images that were conjured up in your mind as a result of that stimulus. So these are pretty simple stimuli, but Edward Titchener was even more extreme in his introspection experiments. So when Edward Titchener went on to establish his own laboratory of psychology at the University of Cornell, he would actually have his graduate students do sort of grueling things. So, for example, he would, for one particular study that he did, he had his graduate students swallow hollow tubes just through the mouth, and those tubes went all the way down the esophagus into the stomach. And then subsequently, he would pour either hot or cold water down the tube and ask them to report again on their sensations, images, and feelings. He also required them to carry a journal with them at all times so they could do introspection or give their introspective reports. For example, when they were urinating or defecating, or when they were engaged in sort of amorous activity with their significant other, they were also asked to give these reports. So a little invasive, right? But this was the primary method. And again, the idea was that if we get introspective reports that are detailed enough, right? So that's why Wundt and Titchener had to train their students beforehand, is they had to be able to provide enough detail about their thoughts, feelings, and sensations in order for us to, or in order for them to break them down to their most basic elements. So in addition to the obvious ethical quandary that Titchener found himself in for his invasive introspective studies with his graduate students, there are also a number of problems with this approach, which I'm sure you guys can generate on your own without even looking at the textbook, right? So one of the problems right away is that in Wundt's laboratory and also Titchener's laboratory, their participants were very, very educated white Protestant males. So right away, this was a very, very small segment of the population that we would argue is quite different from the general population, right? So remember that the primary objective of science is to be able to generalize on the basis of your particular research to the entire population. So all of these introspective studies were working with a very, very small segment of the population that were very different from most people. So obviously the demographics were different. Like I said, they were all white Protestant males. So we didn't have any people of color or any women or people of various socioeconomic statuses represented. But there was also the issue that most people wouldn't be able to provide the kind of detailed introspective reports that Wundt and Titchener were looking for, right? So in order to do introspective studies, you needed very, very smart verbal people that had a lot of knowledge of, for example, vocabulary and things like that, to be able to adequately describe their experiences. So again, we're dealing with a very, very small segment of the population, and because of that, we can't effectively generalize. Another reason why it was difficult to generalize on the basis of these introspective reports was that they were often subjective, right? So they varied from person to person. The thoughts, feelings, and sensations that people had varied from person to person. So if everyone is giving a completely different answer when generating these introspective reports, then we're not able to effectively generalize, right? So for example, maybe I fell into a very thorny rose bush when I was younger, right? So when I look at the picture of the rose, maybe I'm automatically very fearful and very anxious, and maybe my mind is sort of filling up with images of blood because I fell into this thorn bush and it was very painful, etc. Whereas maybe somebody else giving the introspective report, maybe they were involved in a very healthy and satisfying romantic relationship, and the night before they came in to give their introspective reports, their significant other gave them a big bouquet of flowers, right? So they're filled with very happy and positive, affirming feelings when they look at the rose, and their mind conjures up images of their significant other, and so on, right? So right away, those are two examples of very, very different introspective reports to the same stimulus, right? So it's highly subjective and varies from person to person. One of the last sort of biggest problem with introspection or analytic introspection as a scientific technique is that there's no way to verify people's introspective reports for accuracy, right? So there's no way to know whether an individual's interpretation of their own feelings and experiences is correct, right? So there's a lot about our own mind that we are not privy to anyway. So even if participants endeavor to be as truthful as possible, maybe they simply don't have access to the most accurate information, right? And it's also possible that they deliberately deceive the experimenter, right? So we see this with a lot of times if a survey or what have you asks a very controversial question, right? Then a lot of times respondents or people taking the survey won't answer honestly because they don't want to incur some kind of judgment, right? So we could definitely see this happening with introspection. Maybe they don't want to say what they're truly feeling or thinking about when they see a particular stimulus, okay? So all of these are problems associated with introspection. Okay, so now that we've talked about structuralism, we're going to talk about another school of thought that was very influential to the development of cognitive psychology, and that was a school of thought known as behaviorism. So in the early 20th century, there was a pretty dramatic shift in that the focus of psychology moved away from the study of the mind and mental processes. And one of the reasons that psychological scientists decided to no longer focus on the mind and mental processes was that they reacted negatively to Wundt's technique of analytic introspection, or they rejected it as a method of scientific inquiry, right? And why did they react negatively and reject it as a method of scientific inquiry? Well, they did it for all of the same reasons we just talked about, right? So introspection fell out of favor very, very quickly. And as a result of that movement and the negative reaction against it, people started to wonder whether they could actually study the mind or mental processes in a scientific way, right? So instead of focusing on the mind as sort of the locus of what we're going to study scientifically, people started to move toward looking at observable behavior. Okay, so this is a quote from John B. Watson, who was the founder of the behaviorist movement. And it says, "Psychology as the behaviorist views it is a purely objective experimental branch of natural science which needs introspection as little as do the sciences of chemistry and physics. The position taken here is that the behavior of man and the behavior of animals must be considered on the same plane, right? So what does it mean to consider the behavior of man and the behavior of animals on the same plane, right? Well, think about what information we're able to extract from an animal, right? We can't ask a dog or a cat or a bird to comment on their thoughts, feelings, and sensations, right? The only thing we can do is look at their behavior and make that inference ourselves, right? So if I see my little dog Marley limping, right, I can't ask her, does your foot hurt, right? I have to pick her up and maybe inspect her foot and infer from the fact that she's limping that there might be some kind of injury, right? Okay, so like I said, Watson founded a school of thought known as behaviorism, and it said that psychologists shouldn't focus on unobservable processes like thinking and emotions and reasoning. Instead, they should focus solely on observable behavior, right? So as behaviorism became more prominent, which it was incredibly popular, and it became very prominent very quickly, people's focus shifted from what does behavior tell us about the mind, right? So people like Ebbinghaus and Donders used behavior as a window into the mind, whereas behaviorists asked the question, excuse me, what is the relationship between stimuli in the environment and behavior, right? So that was the predominant shift, is instead of focusing on what behavior can tell us about internal mental processes, people started to explain psychology as the study of observable behavior, and the method by which they did that was to focus on associations, right? So what is the association between stimuli in the environment and the resultant behavior that we observe? Okay, so again, the primary assumptions of behaviorism are that in order to be a science, psychologists shouldn't make any reference to mental or internal processes, and we should focus only on behavior and things that are directly observable. Okay, and it also focuses on associative learning. So behaviorists believed that by controlling an organism's environment, whether that organism is a person or a dog or a rat in a cage, whatever the organism might be, if we strictly control the environment and create simple associations, and those associations might be associations forged through classical conditioning, which you guys have reviewed in the videos in this playlist, right? So with classical conditioning, we're coming to associate a conditioned stimulus and an unconditioned stimulus, or operant conditioning, where we're associating a particular response or a particular behavior with an outcome, whether it's a rewarding outcome or a punishing outcome. Virtually any behavior can be learned, right? So under behaviorism, the most important thing is to focus only on observable behavior. And also, it's the assertion that anything can be learned, or an organism can learn virtually anything simply by forging associations, whether they're associations between stimuli or an association between a particular behavioral response and an outcome. Okay, so again, you guys have already reviewed the basics of classical conditioning and operant conditioning, so I won't go into that. Okay, but just know that, like I said, behaviorism was a very, very prominent school of thought that pretty much reigned in psychology from the 1920s to the 1960s, and I would argue even part of the 1970s as well. And so psychologists were able to apply these same techniques of classical and operant conditioning to virtually everything. So they talked about how these techniques can be applied by teachers in the classroom, by mothers and fathers when they're rearing their children, how these techniques can be used to treat psychological disorders. So for example, the treatment of phobias. And also, because a lot of classical conditioning first started with animals, there was an increased interest in animal testing and its significance for public health. Okay, so now we're going to talk about one of the most important things that precipitated or came before the establishment of cognitive psychology as a discipline, and that is the decline of behaviorism. Right? And that would make sense, right? Because behaviorism is saying we can't scientifically study the mind, right? It's impossible to be scientific and also focus on mental or internal processes, right? So in order for cognitive psychology to be accepted, there has to be some revision in that understanding, right? So now we're going to focus on what events sort of caused the decline of this view or caused people to challenge this view that we can't scientifically study the mind and we should instead focus solely on observable behavior. Well, really the decline started with Edward Tolman. So if you were to ask Edward Tolman whether or not he was in support of behaviorism, he would say that he absolutely was. So in fact, he considered himself a behaviorist and that his primary focus was the measurement of behavior. But in reality, we actually consider him to be an early cognitive psychologist because, like Donders and Ebbinghaus, he actually used behavior to infer something about mental processes. So how did he do that? Well, he was a pioneer in an area of animal learning called maze learning. So he basically created something called a T-maze. So in these experiments, this particular experiment occurred in 3 phases. So in the first phase, you would put a rat in the maze, and it would just kind of wander around freely. So it would just kind of run around the maze, kind of freely exploring its environment. And then in the next phase, you would place some food at one of the entrances, right? So in this case, there's a nice piece of cheese at the B entrance there. And you would put a rat in one of the other 3 entrances to the maze. So in this case, we have put a rat at entrance A and the cheese at entrance B, right? And what the rat does very, very quickly is the rat turns right and is rewarded with the food. So the way that a behaviorist would explain this result is through basic operant conditioning, right? The rat learns very quickly that if he turns right, he will be rewarded with food. So where things get interesting is in the last phase of this experiment. So in the last phase of this experiment, the food or the cheese is again placed at entrance B, but this time the rat is placed at entrance C. Right? So in order to get rewarded with the food, the rat now has to turn left. So a behaviorist would say that because all the animal has learned thus far in this experiment is a simple association, right? And that association is if I turn right, I get rewarded with food. The rat shouldn't be able to find food in this case because the rat's automatically going to execute the same response, right? So the rat, having learned in the earlier phase to turn right, is again going to turn right? That's the behaviorist prediction because that's the simple association that they've made, the operant association as a result of operant conditioning. But what's interesting here is that the rat actually gets it right. So the rat actually turns left, right? So this was a huge problem for the behaviorist account because it's clear that the rat actually knows much more than that simple turn right, get food association, right? He knows to turn left in this case. So the way that Tolman explained this result is he said that something very pivotal happens in that first exploratory phase. So in that first exploratory phase, what the rat is doing as it runs around the maze exploring its environment is it actually creates a cognitive map. So it basically creates an internal representation of the maze, right? The same way that we all do, right? When we go to a new place, is we kind of get a sense of our surroundings, right? And any prior exposure, right? So this might not be relevant for us because this is a distance learning class, right? But you might imagine that if you're on Mercer's campus, right, and you go to one of your professor's offices, right, the first time you kind of look around and see maybe where the desk is and where you can sit, if you want to have a conversation with your professor, right? So the next time you go into the office, you automatically know where to go to have a seat, right? So we're all capable of creating an internal representation of our environment. So it stands to reason that a rat would be able to do this as well, right? So again, to summarize, what's happening is the rat creates a mental map or a cognitive map of the maze, as it's exploring the environment, and it consults that map during the third phase here, right? So it doesn't just automatically turn right, but rather it consults that mental representation in order to know which direction to turn, right? So why is this a problem for strict behaviorist accounts, right? Well, it's because, again, Tolman was using the rat's behavior to inform our study of the mind, right? So the rat wasn't simply just learning an association, but the rat was learning to create mental representations, which is definitely an internal or cognitive mentalistic process, not just an overt behavior or a simple association. Okay, all right, so my next two videos are going to focus on other problems for the behaviorist account. Okay, so I'll see you in my next video.